The air in the final hour of the Gilded Fork competition didn't smell like food. It smelled like desperation, reducing veal stock, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Steam hissed violently from the blast chillers, providing a white noise backdrop to the sharp, rhythmic percussion of chopping. But the real heat wasn't coming from the 6-burner range in front of me. It was radiating from the station 3 feet to my left. Bailey was there, her movements infuriatingly precise, plating a molecular garnish with tweezers that cost more than my rent. One slip in focus meant losing the Michelin mentorship, but looking at her felt inevitable. The pull was magnetic, distracting, and dangerous. This kitchen was designed to be a stainless steel cathedral of ego, reflecting every bead of sweat and every tremor of exhaustion under harsh clinical lights that left no shadow to hide in. For 6 weeks, we had been trapped in this high-end pressure cooker. 12 chefs whittled down to just 2. And of course, it had to be her, Bailey. She was the antithesis of everything I stood for. Her station looked like a sterile operating theater, pristine, organized, cold. She cooked like a surgeon, treating ingredients like patients that needed to be cured of their organic imperfections. Her sauces were chemically perfect emulsions, stabilized with hydrocolloids. Her foams held their structure for hours. It was impressive, technically flawless, and it drove me absolutely insane. My station, in contrast, looked like a bomb had gone off in a spice market. I cooked with the chaotic, messy passion I'd learned in my grandmother's failing trattoria, where measurements were suggestions and flavor was a full-contact sport. Bailey hated it, or at least she claimed to. But for the last month, our rivalry had evolved into something sharper, something that felt less like professional disdain and more like jagged flirting. We traded insults like currency. She'd critique the rustic unevenness of my hand-torn pasta. I'd mock the soulless geometry of her plating. But the subtext was always heavy. I remembered the second week, when she'd caught me tasting a ragu with my finger instead of a spoon. She didn't report me for a health code violation. She just watched, her eyes dark and assessing, lingering on my mouth for a second too long before turning back to her sous vide machine. That look had haunted me for 40 days. It was the same look she was wearing now, as she wiped down her already spotless counter. I tried to focus on my risotto, stirring the arborio rice until my arm burned. But my senses were traitorous. I wasn't just smelling the saffron and white wine. I was smelling her. She wore a scent that had no business in a commercial kitchen. Something clean, like cedar and rain, that somehow cut through the heavy grease of the fryer. I could hear the specific cadence of her breathing over the roar of the exhaust hoods, steady and rhythmic, while my own breath hitched in my throat every time she moved into my peripheral vision. It was a distraction I couldn't afford. My grandmother's legacy was currently hanging by a thread, dependent on the prize money and prestige this competition offered. The bank notices were piling up on the counter back home, a stark reality that usually kept me focused. But here, with Bailey tying her apron strings tight around her waist, highlighting the sharp, athletic line of her spine, the fear of bankruptcy was fighting a losing battle against a very different kind of hunger. She reached for her knife, a custom Japanese blade she sharpened every morning with religious devotion. The sound of steel against the cutting board was hypnotic. Chop, chop, chop. It was a metronome counting down the seconds of my sanity. She wasn't just cooking. She was performing a high-wire act of control, and I was the audience she was refusing to acknowledge. I watched her hands, strong and steady, as she segmented a blood orange with terrifying speed. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. "Eyes on your own station," she murmured, not even looking up. Her voice was low, a velvety contralto that vibrated straight through the floor mats and up my legs. She knew. She always knew when I was watching. "Just making sure you haven't turned the garnish into a science experiment," I shot back, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "Focus," she said, finally glancing over. Her eyes were cool, but the corner of her mouth quirked up, a microscopic crack in the armor. "You're going to burn the garlic," I swore under my breath and snatched the pan off the heat. She was right. She was always right. The tension between us coiled tight, a physical thing that seemed to take up more space than the ovens. The stakes of this competition weren't abstract for me. They were tangible, heavy, and smelled of old yeast and cracked tile. Back home, my grandmother's trattoria was dying a slow, agonizing death. It was the place where I had learned to walk, to taste, to love the alchemy of heat and time. But passion doesn't pay the rising rent in a gentrifying neighborhood. The bank notices were no longer polite reminders. They were threats, printed on pink paper, piling up on the scarred wooden counter where Nona used to roll gnocchi by hand. Winning the Gilded Fork meant $50,000 and a mentorship that would bring the kind of press we couldn't afford to buy. Losing meant the trattoria would likely become a high-concept coffee shop within the year. I was cooking for the ghosts of my family, carrying 3 generations of tomato sauce and stubborn pride on my back. I looked over at Bailey. She didn't have ghosts. She had ambition that gleamed as brightly as her knife. She wasn't cooking to save a crumbling building. She was cooking to ascend. She wanted the Michelin stars, the magazine covers, the legacy that started with her name, not ended with it. It made her dangerous because she had nothing to lose, only everything to gain. She moved with a lightness that I envied, a freedom from the crushing gravity of heritage. While I was sweating over the preservation of the past, she was efficiently constructing the future, one perfectly spherical pearl of balsamic vinegar at a time. It was infuriating. It was captivating. The layout of the kitchen forced us together for the final prep. The center island was a communal ground, a neutral territory that felt anything but neutral. We both moved to the stainless steel table simultaneously, the choreography of the kitchen bringing us into a collision course. I needed the finishing salt. She was reaching for the microgreens. The space was tight, designed to test our spatial awareness. But my awareness was entirely focused on the heat radiating from her body. We didn't just bump into each other. It was a collision of orbits. My elbow knocked hard against hers as we both reached for the center of the table. In any other kitchen, with any other chef, it would have been a standard hazard of the trade. A grunt, a quick behind, a step back. But with Bailey, the contact felt like grabbing a live wire. The jolt went straight up my arm, bypassing my brain and hitting somewhere deep in my chest. Neither of us pulled away immediately. That was the tell. For a heartbeat, we stayed there, skin pressed against skin, the friction of our chef coats doing nothing to dampen the sudden, spiking voltage between us. I could feel the tension in her arm, the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the white fabric. She was warm, shockingly so, a furnace burning behind that cool, detached exterior. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. Her eyes were dark, dilated, stripping away the professional veneer to reveal something raw and hungry underneath. The air between us thickened, charged with a silence that screamed louder than the clattering pans around us. "You're crowding my station," she said. But her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. It was lower, huskier, a complaint that sounded suspiciously like an invitation. She didn't step back. "Maybe you're just taking up too much space," I countered, leaning in just a fraction of an inch instead of retreating. The smell of her, that clean, rain-washed scent, filled my lungs, dizzying and sharp. "Your technique is messy," she whispered, her gaze dropping to my hands, then back to my eyes. "Rustic, unrefined. You're going to bruise the herbs if you handle them like that." "It's called soul, Bailey," I murmured, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. "Something your chemistry set wouldn't understand." "Soul doesn't win stars," she shot back, but the corner of her mouth twitched, a suppressed smile that felt like a victory. "Precision does." "Time, chefs, to the stoves!" the head judge bellowed, shattering the moment. The spell broke, but the charge remained. We pulled apart, the loss of contact leaving my skin stinging, a phantom warmth lingering on my arm as we turned back to the rising heat of the fires. The kitchen timer was a relentless, screaming dictator. But my mind was stuck on a missing variable: acid. The risotto was rich, creamy, and technically perfect. But it was boring. It lacked the sharp, bright slap of acidity that would wake up the judges' palates. I needed the heirlooms, the striped, ugly, beautiful tomatoes sitting in the walk-in cooler. I spun on my heel, abandoning my station with a recklessness that would have made my culinary school instructors weep. At the exact same second, Bailey pivoted. It was as if we were tethered by an invisible rope, pulled by the same centrifugal force. We moved toward the heavy steel door of the walk-in at a dead sprint, neither of us willing to yield the right of way. We hit the door handle simultaneously. My hand landed on the cold metal latch. Hers landed directly on top of mine. For a split second, we wrestled with the mechanism, a ridiculous, frantic struggle for dominance over a door, before the latch gave way and we tumbled inside. The door swung shut behind us with a heavy, pressurized thud, the magnetic seal engaging with a finality that severed us from the rest of the world. The silence was sudden and violent. One second, my ears were ringing with the cacophony of shouting, clattering pans, and the roar of the exhaust fans. The next, there was nothing but the low, rhythmic hum of the compressor and the sound of our own jagged breathing. The temperature drop was a physical shock. The air inside started at 38 degrees, a biting, crisp cold that hit my sweat-slicked skin like a slap. It should have been refreshing. Instead, it made every nerve ending on my body stand up and scream. The walk-in was a sensory paradox. It smelled of earth and cold dairy, of chilling basil and the sharp, metallic tang of the shelving units. The light was dim, a single flickering bulb casting long, shivering shadows against the crates of produce. I leaned back against the door, the cold steel seeping through my chef's coat, trying to calibrate my heart rate. Bailey stood 3 feet away, near the shelf of dairy, her chest heaving. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the line, she looked like a machine. But here, in the dim quiet, she looked devastatingly human. The cold air was already reacting with the heat of her body. I could see the faint wisp of steam rising from her skin, a visible aura of the energy she was burning. A single drop of sweat traced a path down her temple, slowing as it hit the cool air, catching the light like a diamond. She wasn't looking at the ingredients. She was looking at me. Her pupils were blown wide, black discs swallowing the hazel irises, dilated by the adrenaline and the sudden dimness. "You're following me," she said, though the accusation lacked any real venom. Her voice sounded too loud in the small, insulated space, breathless and rough. "I need tomatoes," I countered, my voice sounding equally wrecked. "You're the one blocking the produce." "I need heavy cream," she whispered, but she didn't move toward the dairy. We stood there, suspended in the cold, the air between us vibrating with things we weren't saying. The competition felt miles away, locked outside with the heat. In here, it was just the biological reality of 2 people who had been orbiting each other for weeks, finally crashing. I pushed off the door. I told myself I was moving toward the crate of heirlooms on the middle shelf. I told myself this was about the risotto. But as I reached for the crate, my hand shook. I grabbed the edge of the wooden box. Bailey reached out at the same moment, ostensibly to study the shelf, but her hand didn't find the metal rack. It found my wrist. Her fingers were freezing, shocked by the ambient temperature, but her palm was searing hot. The contrast sent a shudder through me that had nothing to do with the thermostat. She didn't pull away. She wrapped her fingers around my wrist, her thumb pressing into the pulse point that was hammering a frantic rhythm against my skin. It was a check, a measurement. She was taking my vitals. "Your heart is racing," she murmured, stepping closer. She was close enough now that I could smell the specific soap she used, something subtle that lay beneath the kitchen smells. "It's the cold," I lied, looking down at her hand on my arm. It looked right there. It looked terrifyingly permanent. "Liar," she breathed. She didn't let go. Instead, she slid her hand up, her fingers trailing over the sensitive skin of my forearm, bypassing the fabric of my coat to find the bare skin near my elbow. "You're terrified." "I'm focused," I managed to say, though my voice cracked. "I'm going to win this, Bailey." "Then why aren't you grabbing the tomatoes?" she challenged, her eyes locking onto mine. She leaned in, invading my personal space, her body heat radiating against me, a siren song in the freezing room. "Why are you just standing here, letting me touch you?" I opened my mouth to answer, to tell her to back off, or maybe to tell her to never stop. But the decision was taken out of my hands. The heavy steel door groaned and swung open, flooding the sanctuary with blinding light and the deafening roar of the kitchen. "5 minutes to service!" the sous chef screamed from the corridor, not even looking inside. The spell shattered. The noise rushed in like a tidal wave, drowning out the hum of the compressor and the sound of my own heartbeat. Bailey snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. The mask slammed back down over her face. The cool, detached rival returned in an instant. But as she grabbed her cream and brushed past me to exit, her shoulder checked mine hard, a solid, heavy impact that lingered long after she disappeared into the chaos. I stood there for a second longer, gripping the cold tomatoes, my skin still burning where she had touched me. I returned to my station, with my pulse still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the ghost of Bailey's touch still burning on my wrist. I needed to center myself. I needed to focus. The timers were screaming their final countdowns, a digital chorus of impending judgment. I had 10 minutes to plate, 10 minutes to save the trattoria, 10 minutes to prove that my chaotic, heart-driven cooking could stand toe-to-toe with Bailey's clinical perfection. I reached for my copper saucepan, the vessel holding the soul of my dish, a red wine and bone marrow reduction I had been nurturing for 3 hours. It was supposed to be a dark, glossy mirror of concentrated flavor, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, rich enough to make the judges weep. I looked down into the pan, and my world ended. It wasn't glossy, it wasn't smooth, it was broken. While I was in the walk-in cooler, getting distracted by the pull of gravity between me and my rival, the emulsion had split. The heat had been too high. The fat had separated from the liquid, pooling in greasy, iridescent slicks on the surface of a grainy, muddy mess. It looked like an oil spill. It looked like failure. The air left my lungs in a rush. The noise of the kitchen, the shouting, the clattering, the hiss of searing meat faded into a muffled buzz, as if I were underwater. Tunnel vision set in, dark and suffocating. I stared at the ruined sauce, paralyzed. This was it. This was the moment the bank took the keys. This was the moment I had to call Nonna and tell her that 70 years of history was ending because I couldn't control my heat. My hand started to shake, a violent tremor that traveled up my arm and settled in my shoulder. I grabbed a whisk, my knuckles white, and tried to beat it back into submission. but it was futile. You can't whisk a broken heart, and you can't whisk a scorched emulsion. The panic was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, hot and heavy. I was drowning on dry land, standing in front of a 6-burner range. Then the light at my station changed. A shadow fell over the copper pot, blocking the harsh glare of the overheads. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. The scent of rain and cedar cut through the smell of burnt butter. Bailey didn't ask what happened. She didn't smirk. She didn't use this moment to secure her victory, which would have been the logical, strategic move. Instead, she stepped into my station. She didn't shove me aside. She moved in behind me, collapsing the space between us until she was practically a second skin. "Don't stop whisking," she commanded, her voice low and rough, vibrating directly against my ear. I froze for a fraction of a second, shocked by the intrusion, by the audacity, by the sudden overwhelming heat of her body pressing against my back. "Move your hand," she murmured, reaching around my right side. Her arm brushed against mine, a long, deliberate slide of fabric against fabric that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. She didn't take the whisk from me. She grabbed a metal bowl of ice water from her prep station and slid it onto the counter next to the burner. "Off the heat," she instructed. Now, I obeyed instinctively, sliding the heavy pot onto the cool, stainless steel. Bailey was boxed in around me, her left hand reaching around my waist to steady the pot handle, her right hand reaching past my shoulder to grab an ice cube. Her chin grazed the top of my shoulder, her breath hot against the sensitive skin of my neck. We were tangled together, a 4-armed creature of desperate necessity. "Whisk," she whispered, dropping the ice cube into the hot, broken mess. "Harder. Find the rhythm." I whisked. I whisked like my life depended on it, because it did. But I wasn't just feeling the resistance of the sauce. I was feeling her. Every rotation of my wrist brought my arm into contact with hers. Her chest was pressed firmly against my back, and I could feel the steady, powerful thud of her heart, beating in time with mine. It was a synchronization. She was grounding me, her solid, cool presence acting as an anchor. "It's coming back," she murmured, her cheek brushing against my temple as she leaned in to inspect the vortex in the pan. "Keep going. Add a drop of cold water. There." She reached for a ladle of cold water, her arm reaching over mine, crossing our limbs in a way that felt obscenely intimate for a professional kitchen. As she poured, her forearm rested on mine for a second, a heavy, deliberate weight. The friction was maddening. The heat from the stove was nothing compared to the heat radiating from where we touched. We fell into a rhythm, a seamless, wordless dance. I whisked, she adjusted the temperature. I tilted the pan, she added the liquid. We were moving as one entity, anticipating each other's needs before they were spoken. Slowly, miraculously, the sauce began to heal. The oil slick vanished, reintegrating into the liquid. The graininess smoothed out. The mixture darkened, turning into the velvet, glossy reduction it was meant to be. It was perfect. Bailey pulled back slowly, peeling herself away from me, layer by layer. The loss of her warmth was instant and aching, leaving my back feeling exposed and cold despite the oven's heat. She stood up straight, stepping back to her own station. But she didn't leave immediately. She lingered for a second, her eyes dark and unreadable, watching me check the consistency. "Perfect," she said quietly. It wasn't a compliment on the sauce. It sounded like an assessment of something else entirely. Then she turned, picked up her tweezers, and went back to her molecular garnish, as if she hadn't just saved my life and ruined my equilibrium in the span of 90 seconds. The sauce was fixed, smooth and rich, but the boundary line between us had been erased. The transition between the chaotic frenzy of prep and the militant precision of service is a strange, liminal space. It's a vacuum. The roaring gas burners are turned down to low flickers of blue pilot light. The violently loud blast chillers cycle off. The judges, those 3 stern arbiters of our fate, retreat to their private chamber to deliberate on the preliminary mise en place, leaving the kitchen in a sudden, ringing silence that feels heavier than the noise. It is the eye of the storm, a deceptive calm before the atmospheric pressure drops and the hurricane makes landfall. Usually, I use this time to wipe my station, to center my breathing, to mentally rehearse the plating of the first course. But today, the silence wasn't bringing me peace. It was amplifying the riot happening inside my own body. My station was clean, my knives were aligned, but my internal equilibrium was completely shot. I stood there, gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter until my knuckles turned white, trying to exorcise the phantom sensation of Bailey's body pressed against mine. It was a physical hallucination that wouldn't fade. My back still burned where her chest had been. The skin on my arms prickled with the memory of her sleeves brushing against me. The ghost of her breath against my neck was more distracting than the heat of the ovens. It was infuriating. I was supposed to be thinking about the texture of my risotto and the stability of my emulsion, but instead, my mind was replaying those 90 seconds on a loop. The way she took control. The way she knew exactly what I needed before I could ask. The way her dominance hadn't felt like a violation, but like a necessary, grounding weight. I looked up. I couldn't help it. The gravity was back, dragging my gaze across the 3 feet of neutral territory to the pass. Bailey was standing there, leaning casually against the lowboy fridge, drinking water from a plastic quart container. She looked impossibly composed. The sweat on her brow had dried, her apron was pristine, and her breathing had returned to that slow, rhythmic cadence that suggested she had ice water in her veins instead of blood. She wasn't checking her prep. She wasn't anxiously organizing her spoons. She was watching me. It wasn't the glare of a rival anymore. That sharp, dismissive look she had worn for 6 weeks, the one that said I was chaotic, undisciplined, and unworthy of the same air she breathed, was gone. In its place was something darker, heavier, and infinitely more terrifying. It was an assessment. She was looking at me the way a jeweler looks at a diamond with a flaw, trying to decide if the imperfection ruins the stone or makes it priceless. Her gaze traveled from my hands, still gripping the counter, up to my face, locking onto my eyes with an unflinching intensity that made my breath hitch. Why did she do it? The question hammered in my skull. She could have let me fail. She could have let the sauce break and watched my grandmother's legacy wash away down the drain. It would have guaranteed her the win. It would have been the smart, clinical play. But she hadn't. She had stepped into the fire with me, and in the heavy silence of the kitchen, looking at the enigmatic curve of her mouth over the rim of that plastic container, the realization hit me with the force of a cast iron skillet. I wasn't just obsessed with beating her. I was obsessed with her. The rivalry wasn't a wall between us. It was a bridge. It was a language we were both speaking, a violent, high-stakes conversation about perfection and passion. I wasn't cooking for the judges anymore. I was cooking to keep that look in her eyes, that dark, hungry recognition that I was a variable she couldn't predict, but couldn't look away from. She lowered the water container, her eyes never leaving mine. She didn't smile, but she nodded. A microscopic dip of her chin. A challenge. I saved you, the gesture said. Now show me it was worth it. The air between us crackled, thick with unspoken things, gratitude, resentment, and a desire so sharp it felt like a blade. I opened my mouth, maybe to say thank you, maybe to tell her to go to hell, but the universe had other plans. Check, check, zzzt. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. The thermal printer on the pass spit out a slip of paper, the noise harsh and mechanical. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. The machine began to chatter a rhythmic, staccato beat of incoming orders. The lull was over. The storm had made landfall. "Service!" the expediter shouted, slamming a ticket onto the rail. Bailey turned away instantly, the connection snapping as she shifted back into combat mode. I took a breath, pushed the longing down into the dark, hot place where I kept my ambition, and reached for my pan. The kitchen dissolved into a blur of stainless steel and white ceramic. Time stopped moving linearly and started moving in jagged, frantic bursts, measured only by the relentless rhythm of the thermal printer. Chick-chick, zzz, ticket. Chick-chick, zzz, ticket. The silence of the prep hour was replaced by a wall of sound. The roar of the gas burners kicked up to high, the violent hiss of searing scallops hitting hot oil, and the cacophony of pans crashing against the metal grates. But in the center of the chaos, the communication dropped to a primal, monosyllabic code. We didn't have time for sentences. We barely had time for breath. Behind, hot, corner, sharp. The words were barked out with military precision, but the tone had shifted. It wasn't the aggressive posturing of the morning anymore. It was the desperate, breathless shorthand of survival. The line was impossibly narrow, a stainless steel trench designed for conflict, forcing us into a proximity that felt dangerous. We were moving at breakneck speed, spinning, reaching, plating, and pivoting in a high-speed ballet of avoidance and contact. I turned to grab a sizzle platter from the oven, the heat blasting my face. Bailey pivoted at the exact same second to grab a squeeze bottle of her hydrocolloid foam. In any other kitchen, with any other chef, we would have collided. We would have crashed into a disaster of spilled sauce and burned skin. But we didn't. We missed each other by millimeters. I felt the wind of her movement against my arm, a rush of displaced air that carried her scent, that maddening mix of cedar, rain, and now the salty tang of hard work. It happened again and again. A hip check to close a drawer while I reached over it. A duck under my arm as I lifted a tray. We were orbiting each other in the tight space, pushing and pulling in a dizzying display of spatial awareness. The heat lamps overhead beat down on the pass, turning the plating area into a glowing orange sauna. The light bathed us in a surreal, feverish glow. I could see the sheen of sweat glistening on the back of Bailey's neck, right where the fine hairs escaped her cap. I watched a single drop track a slow path down to her collar, and I had to physically wrench my focus back to the risotto in front of me to keep from reaching out and touching the damp skin. Then came the rush for table 7. The expediter called for hands, and the boundary between our stations dissolved completely. We weren't just cooking side by side anymore. We were plating on the same canvas. I slid the ceramic plates down the rail. I laid the foundation, the rich, dark risotto, spreading it with a single, confident slap of the spoon. Before I could even reach for the protein, Bailey was there. She placed the seared scallop with surgical precision right in the center of my rice. My hand came in with the garnish, micro basil and edible flowers. Her hand wove underneath mine to drop a precise geometric dot of balsamic reduction. We were weaving over the plates, our arms crossing and uncrossing, hands fluttering like birds in a cage. It was mesmerizing. It was terrifying. It was a dance of trust that we hadn't earned but somehow possessed. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. I knew she was going to reach for the tweezers before her muscle even twitched. She knew I was going to wipe the rim of the plate before I even grabbed the towel. It was a flow state I had never experienced with another human being. It wasn't just competition, it was compatibility. It was a terrifyingly efficient chemistry that made everything else in the room fade away. I realized with a jolt that nearly made me drop my tongs that this was the most intimate thing I had ever done. The way our rhythms locked together, the way her clinical precision elevated my rustic chaos, and the way my depth of flavor grounded her airy techniques. It was a marriage on a plate. The friction between us wasn't an obstacle. It was the fuel. We were a machine, a two-headed, four-handed monster devouring the service. I caught her eye across the pass as we sent the plates. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly under her chef coat. Her pupils were blown wide, black holes swallowing the hazel. She looked at the food, then at me, and for the first time, the mask was completely gone. There was no rivalry in that look. There was only the raw, undeniable recognition of an equal. She knew it, too. She felt the current running through the stainless steel counter connecting our hands. "Order fire!" the expediter shouted, shattering the moment. "Last ticket, the head judges, 3 covers. Make them perfect." The spell broke, but the vibration remained. The final test was here. The adrenaline that had acted as a high-octane fuel for the last 3 hours abruptly ran dry. It didn't taper off gently. It crashed. One moment, I was a machine of culinary efficiency, fueled by the rhythm of the printer and the heat of the stove. And the next, I was just a tired woman standing on aching feet with a grandmother's legacy crushing her spine. The final ticket, the one for the head judges, sat on the rail like a death sentence. This was the plate that decided everything. The $50,000, the mentorship, the survival of the trattoria. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, a vacuum waiting for us to finish the masterpiece. I reached for the finishing spoon. My hand, which had been steady through 6 weeks of grueling challenges, suddenly rebelled. It wasn't a large movement, just a microscopic tremor in my radial nerve, a spasm of pure exhaustion. But when you are holding a spoonful of dark, viscous demi-glace over a pristine white ceramic plate, a microscopic tremor is a catastrophe. I watched in slow motion as the sauce slipped. It didn't land in the center of the protein where it belonged. It dripped, heavy and black, onto the negative space of the rim. The splash was small, but against the stark white porcelain, it looked like a gunshot wound. I froze. The world narrowed down to that single, ugly black smear. In that droplet, I saw the for sale sign going up in the window of the trattoria. I saw my grandmother's face, not disappointed, but resigned, packing up her pasta rollers in the dim light of a closed kitchen. I saw the bank managers winning. The panic wasn't hot, it was ice cold. It paralyzed my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I had 30 seconds to get this plate to the pass, and I had just ruined it. There was no time to replate the base components. There was no time to wipe the rim without leaving a greasy smear that would scream amateur to the Michelin judges. I was done. I was dead in the water. Then, a hand entered my field of vision. It wasn't the expediter. It was Bailey. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the plate. In her left hand, she held a tray of her final garnish, delicate, intricate tuiles made of dehydrated parsnip and gold leaf. They were geometric masterpieces, fragile as glass, the crowning jewel of her technical perfection. She had exactly 3 perfect ones for her 3 plates. She didn't hesitate. She took the most perfect one, the one with the sharpest angles and the most even gold distribution. And she didn't place it on her plate. She reached across the divide. With a movement so smooth it looked rehearsed, she slid the tuile onto my plate. She placed it artistically, deliberately, right over the black smear of sauce. The curve of the parsnip hid the mistake completely, incorporating the rogue drop as if it were a shadow, an intentional anchor for the garnish. It transformed the error into art. I gasped, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. "Bailey, that's your—" "Plate it," she hissed, her voice rough. She turned back to her own station. I watched, paralyzed, as she picked up her spare tuile, the one with the slightly chipped corner, the one she had rejected during prep. She placed the imperfect garnish on her own plate, the plate that was going to the head judge. It was a flaw, a tiny, jagged edge that the judges would absolutely notice. She knew it. I knew it. She had just sabotaged her own perfection to save me. The weight of the gesture crushed the air out of my lungs. Why? Why would she risk $50,000 for me? "Hands!" the expediter shouted. We pushed the plates to the pass. My dish saved by her geometry. Her dish compromised by her mercy. "Service!" The word echoed off the stainless steel. It was over. The cooking was done. The kitchen didn't cheer. It just exhaled. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, my chest heaving, staring at Bailey's rigid back. She was stripping off her gloves, her movements jerky and angry. She wouldn't look at me. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was screaming. It was filled with the terrifying realization that this wasn't just about cooking anymore. She hadn't saved the dish. She had saved me. And the debt felt heavier than the mortgage on the trattoria. The walk from the kitchen to the judging chamber was a transition between worlds. We left the humid, violent heat of the line, where the air was thick with the scent of searing meat and adrenaline, and stepped into a corridor that felt like an airlock. The silence here was heavy, pressurized, and sterile. Bailey walked beside me, her stride long and rigid. She hadn't looked at me since the plating disaster. She stared straight ahead, her jaw set so tight I could see the muscle feathering beneath the skin of her cheek. The distance between us, which had been non-existent mere minutes ago, had snapped back into place, but the air still vibrated with the memory of our collision. We entered the chamber. It was a cavernous room with high ceilings and acoustics that were designed to amplify judgment. A long table draped in stark white linen sat on a raised dais. Behind it sat the tribunal, 3 of the most feared palates in the culinary world, bathed in unforgiving studio lights that made them look less like chefs and more like gods deciding on a smiting. We stood at attention in front of the table, hands clasped behind our backs. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I watched Chef Sterling, the head judge, pick up his fork. The sound of silverware scraping against ceramic echoed in the silent room like a shriek. They tasted Bailey's dish first. Sterling took a bite of her scallop, his face an unreadable mask of critical concentration. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing as he dissected the flavor profile. Then, his gaze dropped to the plate. He used the tip of his knife to point at the tuile, the chipped, imperfect garnish she had used to save me. "Chef," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold, "your technique is usually synonymous with perfection. You are a mathematician in an apron. Yet, this garnish, it is flawed. The edge is broken. It is a surprising lapse in discipline for a chef of your caliber." Bailey didn't flinch. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't glance at me to share the blame. She just nodded, accepting the critique with a stoic grace that made my chest ache. "Yes, chef," she said simply. It was an error in judgment during selection. Then, Sterling turned to my plate. He took a bite of the risotto, humming thoughtfully at the depth of the reduction, the sauce we had saved together. But then his eyes narrowed. He looked at the garnish sitting atop my rustic plating, the perfect, geometric, golden tuile that Bailey had slid onto my dish. "And you," Sterling said, turning his sharp gaze on me, "you cook with emotion. You cook with history. Your plates are usually chaotic, honest, but messy. Yet today, I see this." He gestured to the pristine garnish hiding my mistake. "This element is precise. It is architectural. It is clinically perfect. It is completely at odds with your usual style, and yet..." He paused, looking back and forth between our two plates. He took another bite of mine, then another of hers. A frown creased his forehead, not of displeasure, but of deep, calculating confusion. "The acidity in your reduction," he murmured, looking at me. "It mirrors the brightness in her foam. The structure of this garnish, it balances the looseness of your risotto. These two dishes, they aren't fighting each other." The other two judges leaned in, tasting from each other's plates, murmuring in agreement. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The tension wasn't about the flaws anymore. It was about the impossible connection between the plates. "They are conversing," the second judge whispered, looking stunned. "It is a dialogue." Sterling set his fork down. The clatter was final. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together, fixing me with a stare that felt like it could peel the skin off my bones. "I have watched you two compete for 6 weeks, he said. "You have been oil and water, fire and ice. But this," he gestured to the plates, "this is a marriage of styles. It is an unexpected harmony that I did not think either of you capable of achieving alone." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and screaming. "Tell me, chef," he asked, his voice soft but demanding. "What changed? What drove a chaotic cook to suddenly embrace such rigid perfection? What happened in that kitchen to create this synergy?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood frozen. I could lie. I could tell him I had been practicing molecular gastronomy in secret. I could tell him I had a sudden epiphany about geometry. I could claim the skill as my own and take the credit for the mentorship. It's what a competitor would do. It's what I should do to save the trattoria. But the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. I couldn't claim her perfection as my own, not after she had sacrificed it for me, not after the way she had held me together when I was falling apart. I turned my head. I looked at Bailey. She was already watching me. Her hazel eyes were wide, dark, and unflinching. She wasn't signaling me to lie. She wasn't begging me to keep her secret. She was looking at me with that same intense, terrifying challenge she had thrown down at the pass. "I showed you who I am," her eyes said. "Now, are you brave enough to do the same?" The connection between us was undeniable. The judges were waiting for an answer about cooking, but looking at her, I knew I was about to give them an answer about something else entirely. I took a breath, and it rattled in my chest like a loose screw in an engine. The smart play was right there, hanging in the air like a ripe fruit. All I had to do was talk about learning curves and adapting to pressure. Sterling would eat it up. He wanted a narrative about self-improvement and the pedagogical value of his competition. But looking at Bailey, standing there with her chin high and her reputation dented for my sake, the smart play felt like a betrayal. She hadn't played it smart. She had played it with heart. She had broken her own rules to save me. She deserved the truth, even if I had to bleed it out on the floor in front of 3 strangers. "It wasn't a sudden epiphany about geometry, chef," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the acoustic perfection of the chamber, It carried like a shout. I turned my body. I physically turned my back on the head judge, a breach of protocol that probably cost me points. But I didn't care. I faced Bailey. I didn't cook this plate for the prize money, I confessed, the words tumbling out, raw, unpolished, and terrifying. I didn't even cook it for the mentorship or to save my grandmother's restaurant. I cooked it because I couldn't bear the thought of serving something unworthy of standing next to her work. Bailey's eyes widened. A flicker of something, shock maybe, or recognition, darted across her face. She stopped breathing. For 6 weeks, I thought I was fighting her, I continued, the confession gaining momentum, fueled by the adrenaline that was still coursing through my veins. I thought her perfection was an insult to my chaos. But today, on the line, I realized that her standard is the only one that actually matters to me. The harmony you taste, that's not technique, chef. That's obsession. I heard a pen scratch on paper, loud and harsh, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The precision on my plate exists because she demanded it, I whispered, my gaze locked on hers, daring her to look away. And the soul in her dish exists because she was brave enough to let me in. The tension didn't break us. I let the admission hang there. It was a professional suicide note, wrapped in a love letter. I was telling them that my focus wasn't the food. It was the woman standing next to me. I was admitting that I had let a rival get under my skin, into my head, and eventually onto my plate. I waited for the gavel to fall. I waited to be disqualified for lack of focus. Chef Sterling blinked. He looked from me to Bailey, then down at his notes, clearing his throat awkwardly. He clearly interpreted my emotional hemorrhage as some kind of high-minded, intense, professional respect. He saw the art, but he missed the artist. Well, Sterling said, adjusting his glasses, looking slightly uncomfortable with the raw intimacy of the answer, but impressed nonetheless. It seems competition truly does breed excellence, an intense partnership. He didn't get it. He saw chefs. He didn't see the electricity arcing between us, hot enough to sear a steak. But Bailey did. For the first time in 40 days, the stoic, clinical mask didn't just slip. It shattered. The corner of her mouth curled up. It wasn't the smirk of a rival. It was a small, triumphant, knowing smile. It was a smile that said, "I heard you." It was a smile that said, "Finally." "Thank you, chefs," she said, her voice dropping to that low, velvety register that made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't look at them either. She was looking right back at me. "We are grateful for the opportunity to push each other." "Dismissed," Sterling said, waving a hand, eager to get back to the safety of his scorecards. "We will deliberate." We walked out of the chamber into the cool, empty hallway. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the judgment behind us. The silence out here was different. It wasn't expectant anymore. It was resolved. Bailey didn't say a word about the win or the loss. She just pushed open the heavy exit door to the alley and waited, holding it open for me, her silhouette cut sharp against the evening light. "Well," she murmured, her eyes dark and promising. Aprons off. The competition was over, but the real heat was just starting. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe for the next course.